Hello and a massive big warm welcome to this week's edition of the Soul Sync podcast. I hope you're keeping really well. How am I doing? I'll tell you a bit about what's been going on in my world over the last few weeks. Ever since the spring equinox, I feel like I have been planting lots of seeds on things that I want to do, things that I want to achieve. I've been working on some new projects at work, and it's really been all stations go. Also, in the last few weeks, I've become a single man again, which I must admit, it's really allowed me to kind of look at my life, put myself back as number one, and make sure that I'm sort of doing all the things that I want to do, because I really do believe that you have to put yourself as number one in life, because if you're not okay, then you're not going to be around to look after number 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. I wanted to talk to you about a few exciting updates as well about the Soul Sync. So over the next few weeks, you'll start to notice on my YouTube channel, which is Jason Paul Medium, that I'm going to be releasing videos all tied into my personal growth and things that I have been through, experiences that I've lived, lessons that I've learned, and I want to share these videos to help as many of you as possible. So there's going to be a whole range of different videos on loads of different topics, everything from my spiritual awakening to my dark night of the soul, and even I'm going to be talking about my business success, because I haven't talked massively about my business on this podcast, but I literally left school, no GCSEs, and went on this big long journey to saving up some money in the recruitment industry that eventually led me to start my own business, which I grew to be a multi-million pound turnover. And working in the recruitment industry, I've seen so many people skyrocket in their careers, a lot of people plateau, and I've got so much experience that I want to share with you. So if you feel stuck in your career, or you don't feel like you're where you want to be, or you don't feel you're earning what you want to earn, do keep an eye out for these videos. Just go and subscribe to my YouTube channel, Jason Paul Medium, and then you'll be notified as soon as they come up. At the moment, I'm trying to get my head around Adobe Premiere Pro, which is what I edit the videos in. So I've been watching lots of YouTube channels to try to work out how to make these videos very appealing and easy to digest. Now, this week's episode, we're talking to an absolute superstar in the world of spirituality, Dr. Eben Alexander. Now, the first time I came across Dr. Eben Alexander was a few years ago when I was in Greece. My mum and I were sitting down one evening, having a glass of wine, and we eventually got onto the subject of death. Now, we were talking about my grandparents, and then my mum started to talk about when she might pass, and I said to my mum, please, don't talk to me about death. I don't like it. I don't want to ever think about you dying. That's really not the conversation I want to have, because back then I was absolutely petrified of death. I just thought to myself, you live life and then one day you die, and it just didn't make sense to me. You know, what is the point in life? So my mum had read a book by Dr. Eben Alexander, his first book, Proof of Heaven, which she led me, and I must say it piqued my curiosity beyond belief, hearing about his near-death experience. And I think what made it so interesting was the fact that he had a materialist worldview, and he was an academic neurosurgeon. So it seemed like he was a really credible person to talk about this subject. So that led me on to this massive big kind of exercise of looking and researching near-death experiences, which eventually led me to start to ask a lot of questions about the spirit world. And that led me to the Arthur Findlay College, and then you know how the story goes from there, because I've spoke about it. So in this week's episode, we're talking to academic neurosurgeon Dr. Eben Alexander, whose career includes decades as a physician and associate professor at Harvard Medical School. Now, like I said, he was very committed to a materialist worldview, the belief that the physical world is all that exists. His scientific belief system was altered in 2008 by a near-death experience where he went into a week-long coma. Now, despite a very bleak medical prognosis, Dr. Alexander awoke to make a full recovery. His medical case and recovery were validated in the peer-reviewed Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease. Now, since his near-death experience, These days, Dr. Alexander speaks all around the world to educate about the role that consciousness plays in wellness, healing and recovery. Now, he's been featured in more than 400 media interviews, including ABC's Good Morning America, Oprah, Super Soul Sunday, Larry King Live, Fox and Friends, Discovery Channel, and many, many more. His books are available in more than 40 countries: Proof of Heaven, A Neurosurgeon's Journey into the Afterlife, and his more recent book, The Map of Heaven: How Science, Religion, and Ordinary People Are Proving the Afterlife. Honestly, you really are in for a treat this week. I hope you enjoy. So, Dr. Eben Alexander, firstly, a massive warm welcome to the Soul Sync podcast.
Well, Jason, thanks so much for having me on. It's great to be with you today.
So, like I was just telling you before the show started, and I'm going to tell the audience this because I think it's a really interesting story, actually. I first became aware of Dr. Alexander's work when me and my mum were in Greece about 5 years ago, and we were having a conversation where she started talking about death. And I said, please don't talk about death. Please don't talk about it. I don't like that subject. And she said, well, why? It happens to us all. I said, I just don't like it. It's the end. And she was reading Dr. Alexander Eben's book, and then passed it to me, obviously, with lots of the corners folded down. And I started to delve into it. And that very book is what led me onto this spiritual journey that I'm on. So it's so surreal to be sitting opposite you now. So firstly, welcome.
Well, great to be here. And I'm so glad it helped you. I mean, I've heard from, many thousands of people who've had their own kind of experience like mine, and it helped them to come to a deeper understanding of it. So I'm so glad it helped you. And especially this whole issue of death and fear of death in our culture is, a major issue. And there are some deep truths about all of this that should be reassuring. And that's what I was trying to share in Proof of Heaven.
So, for people that don't know you necessarily or your book, I'm sure loads of people are going to, but for people that don't, your story, because let's give some context to it. You are a neurosurgeon. That is what you do. Explain to us your life before what happened to you back all those years ago in 2008.
Right. So we're about 15 and a half years out from when it all happened. At that time, I was 54 years old. I had practiced neurosurgery. I taught neurosurgery at Harvard Medical School for 15 years. Mm-hmm. Thought I had some understanding of brain, mind, and consciousness. But I confess that I harbored a very conventional scientific worldview. And that conventional view is one of materialism or physicalism. And what physicalism says about it all is the brain creates consciousness out of purely physical matter, and that things like thoughts, beliefs, attitudes, insights, intuitions have no basis in reality at all. And so that was kind of the world I lived in. Now, my own father, my adoptive father, because adoption is a giant part of my story for those who've read Proof of Heaven. But anyway, my adoptive father was a globally renowned neurosurgeon, and he was very influential in my life. He was a tremendous role model and mentor. He had been a combat surgeon in the Second World War in the Pacific Theater for over two years. In fact, I still have his little pocket Bible that was Psalms and New Testament that I think got him through that. His faith in God and prayer got him through World War II relatively unscathed. And he was always very comfortable as a scientist, leading a neurosurgical program, very aware of modern physics and cosmology. But his belief in God was perfectly consistent with every bit of that. Now, like so many of us who grew up in the 60s and 70s, like I did, I always knew science is the pathway to truth. I wanted to believe some of what I heard in the Methodist Church growing up, but it had to be consistent with the science that I was learning in school and that I was practicing. And for me, that led to some confusion over a few decades as to how conscious awareness could survive the death of the brain and body. And that's why I think I had such an extraordinary deep dive of an experience in 2008. But the person I was November 10th, 2008, who woke up with that severe back pain at the very beginning of my week in coma, that person was, a conventional materialist neurosurgeon who thought brain creates consciousness and our existence is birth to death, nothing more. And I now realize that is woefully inadequate to explain human experience and the nature of reality that we have based on evidence of what happens to human beings. So that's where the whole thing gets very, very exciting. But essentially, the lesson is that consciousness is primary, that all of the physical world emerges from the mental, not the other way around. And that's one of the reasons why scientists have been so confused by quantum physics and other aspects of neuroscience and philosophy of mind that don't really fit with the big model they think is true, because we need a much bigger model than that. And that's what my journey and my 15 years since that time working with other scientists around the world is all about.
Because I struggle to even comprehend how you can have, it's one thing kind of having a belief system and it's another worldview. And I guess it's another thing being an associate professor at Harvard Medical School, not just believing it, practicing it, coming from that family, that was your way of life. So the near-death experience that happened to you, I want to touch on it briefly, but I don't want to go too much into it because I think there's so much more I want to talk to you about. But just sort of briefly touch on what happened to you on that day in 2008.
Okay, well, I will try and be brief. One of the very unusual...
Or you be as long as you want. I will say that. You go however long you want.
I do want to have plenty of time for discussion, and
yes,
people can learn the deep details of my experience by reading Proof of Heaven or looking at there are many YouTube videos out there available for free that where I tell my story. So all that is there in detail for people who want to learn more. But I think the main thing to point out, first of all, that very unusual feature. In fact, I've never heard of this as a main ingredient of other NDEs, but NDEs are always tailored to the individual. So for a neurosurgeon fascinated by consciousness, the brain-mind connection, nature of reality, I needed an especially deep dive, and that's exactly what I got. And it demanded amnesia, that I have a complete loss of memories going into it. And I have to tell people, don't worry, that's probably not going to happen to you unless you're a neurosurgeon or neuroscientist fascinated by consciousness. So anyway, amnesia is an important concept because it separates mind from many others. And also important to point out that the medical details that I point out in the book Proof of Heaven were greatly strengthened and amplified in a peer-reviewed case report on my medical records that came out in September 2018 in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases. And the three doctors who wrote that report, not involved in my care, but fascinated by my recovery, made the point that my brain was far too incapacitated for you to expect any kind of dream or hallucination to come out of it. That's what haunted me after my own story, after it happened. And then when I went back to investigate in the months after my coma, it didn't line up. I mean, neuroscience tells us all these things about the neocortex and its relationship to consciousness. And yet my neocortex, by medical facts of my case, was far too damaged to host any dream or hallucination. So there was a deep mystery there that I had to get to the bottom of. And it's one of the reasons, the fact I was driven into coma due to meningitis, it's one of the main reasons the scientific community pays so much attention to my case. And then, of course, the other big point they made is my recovery is really unprecedented. Now, for most people in medicine, they can't really know that. They can't tell that from reading these medical details. But to anybody in medicine or healthcare, you read that case report and you go, oh, my God, this guy is a goner. There's no way there's a hallucination or dream coming out of that brain. So how did this all happen? So that's kind of where we're at. And also the survival, as I said, to explain the survival, the peer review editors challenged those three authors and said, how do you explain this? It's unprecedented in the medical literature for somebody to spend a week in coma, deep coma, according to neurologic exams here and CT and MRI scans, and then make a full recovery. How do you explain it? And they said it's because he had a near-death experience. And they knew of other similar cases of near-death experiences with absolutely miraculous medical healing. So that's the kind of backstory. Anyway, so in the journey itself, in the setting of complete amnesia, it started in what I call the earthworm's eye view, a primitive course unresponsive realm, like being in dirty jello. It seemed to go on for a very long time, but luckily not forever. I was rescued by a slowly spinning white light that came packaged with a perfect musical melody. And this white light served as a portal up into this rich, ultra-real Gateway Valley. And the Gateway Valley, very important to stress, this is not a vague and murky dreamlike space. It is much more real than this world. This world is the dream compared to the ultra reality that we experience in those spiritual realms. And it's because really the brain does a lot more to kind of reduce consciousness than to produce it. And so when we're liberated from the brain and body, like at the time of death or in a near-death experience, our consciousness expands tremendously. So for example, in this Gateway Valley, it would be the place where people would have life reviews. Life reviews have been described going back thousands of years in NDEs. And the life review is very interesting because it's much more of a demonstration of how we're sharing one mind. Because in the life review, in a recent study from Bruce Grayson, in 700 life reviews that he reviewed in his near-death experience database, he found that something like 74% of the people reported they were experiencing the events, but from the perspective of everybody involved. So in other words, if you're busy handing out pain and suffering to others, greedy, selfish, etc., in the life review, you feel what that is like to be exposed to that, dealt out by, someone else, so in other words, it's a beautiful example of treat others as you would like to be treated. Because in the life review, we get to feel what it feels like that we treated other people in all the different ways we did. And so anyway, in this particular setting of it, in my experience, I couldn't have an Eben Alexander life review because of my amnesia, but I had a very profound vision of reincarnation in life reviews as I ascended up through these multiple levels. So in this Gateway Valley, very dramatically real, kind of earth-like, but spiritual ingredients. It's like Plato's world of ideals, but for the individual soul. And I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. Never at any point did I have any kind of body awareness. I was just aware of what was going on around me. And on this butterfly wing with millions of other butterflies above this beautiful valley, that was my vantage point. And in the valley below were thousands of beings kind of going off into the distance. I call them souls between lives when I wrote it all up weeks later. And I remember the most beautiful thing about it was there was a companion on the butterfly wing. She never said a word, never had to, but sparkling blue eyes, high cheekbones, high forehead, beautiful smile. She looked at me with a look of pure love. And her message telepathically into my awareness, you are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You are richly cared for. And I cannot tell you how refreshing and validating that was in that moment. And it turns out that was just the gateway, as I said, on my journey. And so from that point, I witnessed yet another portal forming up from the chants and anthems and hymns that were thundering down from these angelic choirs up above in this beautiful Gateway Valley. And I remember all of four-dimensional space-time collapsing down, all of deep time and that spiritual realm. And here I'm noting, pay attention, that if in life reviews commonly describe birth, death, everything in between can be simultaneously presented to you, that's a whole different ordering of causality. One of the reasons why these journeys are so absolutely impossible to put into words using our very limited language. And this is
language is one of the big problems, isn't it? How do you explain
it? It's a horrific problem. It's one of the reasons why in our third book, Living in a Mindful Universe, where we bring the science and spirituality together and make these arguments about how all this is showing us primacy of consciousness, but it also reveals the power of our free will as souls. And this is all stuff that we cover in our third book, Living in a Mindful Universe, which really goes the distance. But anyway, back to my story. In that beautiful, what I ascended to is what I call a core. The core was a complete resolution of all dualities. We live in a world of dualities. You have darkness, light, good, evil, masculine, feminine, etc. But in those spiritual realms, all of that begins to coalesce into oneness. And in fact, in the core realm, I recognize that my very conscious awareness was directly sourced in that infinitely loving God force at the core of creation. And that was one of the things I hesitated when I came back to call that deity that I perceived, that infinitely loving force, God, because for me, God was a word with a lot of baggage to it. I called it Om because that was the sound I heard as a resonance in eternity and infinity. That is exactly what I heard. And so Om is the term.
Right.
Om, that was the sound. And to make the point, very importantly, I came back realizing it doesn't matter if you want to call that force God or Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh. All those are petty little human attempts to claim ownership of this through a religious ideology. But ultimately, this loving power of kindness and beautiful connection, unconditional love that so many near-death experiencers have witnessed, that is what the deepest form of our reality. And there's not a battle between good and evil at the heart of the spiritual universe. It's pure oneness and love. And yet, as we get out there, way out in the periphery towards the material world and our ego personalities, you start to run into all kinds of toxicity and problems and mismatches. But ultimately, the journey described by NDEers, by people who've come close to death, is one of getting really into that world of peace and love and comfort, a spiritual home that is very refreshing and reassuring. And that's what I was witnessing. I would cycle through these multiple levels, multiple times. Again, there's so much more of this story, but all that is called the Proof of Heaven and other sources for people who really want to get dig into the details. But ultimately, what happened was I was told every time I entered the Corps, we'll teach you many things, but you're not here to stay. And in fact, I'd come to believe that going back down to the earth were my view, and then by remembering the musical notes of the melody to conjure up these light portals that led me back up into the higher levels, that's all I needed to know. But no, that was not so. And there came a point where I could no longer conjure up that light portal to take me up out of the earth were my view. And that's when I witnessed thousands of beings going off in the distance, heads bowed, many holding candles, this murmuring energy coming from them that was welcoming me back. So even in this kind of dark, murky earth were my view, I was sensing the beautiful glory and love and connection of that spiritual realm. And it was coming from these beings around me. And that's what I called that in my writings weeks later. It was the power of prayer to kind of draw me back. I explained that much more detailed fashion in the book. But anyway, the last thing I saw were 6 faces that bubble up out of the muck, would say a few words and disappear. My amnesia was still active, so I didn't understand the words, but I remember their faces as brightly and vividly in detailed fashion as if that whole thing happened just yesterday. I mean, these memories are astonishingly vivid and alive and vibrant and resilient. And those 6 phases are very important because they served as veridical time anchors to help me conclude that the vast majority of my spiritual journey happened between days 1 and 4 or 1 and 5 of my 7-day coma. I explained the timing of all that in the book, so that's where you can figure that out. But the bottom line is it was the last phase that really drew my attention. It was a 10-year-old boy. I still was amnesic, didn't recognize him. It was my 10-year-old son, Bond. They had protected Bond from the worst news during that week, but that Sunday morning, day 7, he was outside of the conference room, overheard the doctors saying I'd gone from 10% chance of survival down to 2%, no chance of recovery. And therefore, it was time to take me off the ventilator, take me off the 3 powerful antibiotics I'd been on, and just let me go. And when Bond heard that, things were much worse than he'd been told. Runs down the hallway, pulls open my eyelids, one eye looking over there, one over there, neither pupil working. Anybody in medicine knows that's a horrible picture. And I promise you, I didn't see him with my eyes or hear him with my ears, but his message got through. I was very far from this world in the dying process. And his message, it was basically, Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay. As if his 10-year-old pleading could make that so. And obviously it worked in some fashion because he was what guided me back to this world. And I'll confess, because of my amnesia, most of this journey, I thought this can continue, it can cease, nothing matters. But when I saw his face and sensed his kind of pleading, even though I didn't understand the words, but I knew I had a tremendous responsibility as a soul. There was another soul out there. And that was really what drew me back, was that sense of love for his soul, even though I didn't really know who he was at the time. But I could sense we had a deep connection and that I had to come back. And when I did come back and woke up in the ICU room, my brain was just wrecked from the meningitis. I didn't even recognize my mother, my sisters, my sons at the bedside. All I knew was where I'd just been, this incredible spiritual journey. But memories from my life before came back slowly over 2 months or so, but everything came back over 2 months. That's the fascinating thing. And in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, we discuss how memories are not even stored in the brain. It's one of the last nails in the coffin of materialist neuroscience that memories are not stored in the brain, but we discuss it in great detail in the book and make that case. And I think most neurosurgeons would agree. We've never had a case where any brain resection, including hemispherectomies in young children who have severe seizure disorders, half the brain removed, never has there been an example where anybody lost long-term memories by resection of brain. So we've doubted that whole assumption for a long time, but now we discuss the proof behind it in Living in a Mindful Universe.
Do you know what? Considering so much of what you're talking about, like we just said, is really hard to put into words, I think you do an absolutely fantastic job. I guess, what was it like to integrate back into when you did come round, and how did you explain this to, because you went from that belief system to this, how did you even go about explaining this to your family and the fact that it changed everything from the rest of your life changed from that moment? How did the integration process work?
Well, the integration, it actually was a much more challenging, deeper, vexing set of conflicts than you can imagine. I mean, when I first was waking up, I tried to explain to my doctors in the first few days about this experience, and they would pat me on the back and say, well, your brain was soaking in pus. In fact, we can't even figure out how you're coming back to us. You were so ill. But the good news is you are coming back. So you can forget about all that. It's a trick of the dying brain. So that was my default assumption. We believe our doctors. And all my medical neurosurgical knowledge was gone for the time being, yet to return over 2 months. And so I began as my own worst skeptic, thinking, wow, what a hallucination. That was incredible. But I did not yet realize how ill my brain was, and that my brain, the medical parameters of the case would prove that brain could not have hosted a dream or hallucination or a confabulation. That brain was in no shape for any of that. So all the tenets of modern neuroscience are greatly challenged by this kind of case. But it was in going back in the next weeks and months for follow-up visits, talk with my doctors, go through the medical records, go through all those Glasgow Coma scales and neurologic exams, CT and MRI scans, showing that all of my brain was infected. There was no part that was left unscathed that would allow for any little island of brain to create this little confabulation. So, and it was much richer than anything I'd ever experienced. So the deep mystery to me was, how is it that by taking the brain offline with such severe damage that you can have an extraordinary enhancement and clarity of mental processes? And it's because consciousness is not created by the brain. It's filtered in by the brain. But our primary consciousness is actually much richer and more expanded. And that's why near-death experiencers are universally explaining these incredible expansions of consciousness to witness their entire life, reconnect with souls of departed loved ones, have telepathic ability to connect with other souls, like in the form of what's called a shared death experience, where a dying soul will often take a bystander soul along, even to the point of witnessing a full-blown life review before that bystander soul comes back. That's called a shared death experience, and they are not uncommon. But anyway, I had to go through this incredible wrestling match in my own mind of struggling out of all this to make sense of it. The more I learned of my medical records and everything, the more I realized, no, my brain could not have created all these phenomenal experiences. So where'd they come from? And so then by the time you get to our third book, Living in a Mindful Universe, you find that we are using the principle of consilience. That is, we take data from neuroscience and what's called the hard problem of consciousness, defined by David Chalmers in the mid-1990s. It's actually an impossible problem for materialists. In other words, there's no way that materialism will end up succeeding in describing consciousness, given the challenge of the hard problem. But it goes far beyond that. Philosophy of mind, the binding problem, the apparent unity of consciousness. Everything that I see, hear, sense, body awareness, access to memories, executive function, it's all one unified whole. And that's hard to explain if it's coming from a bunch of different neuronal populations in a big network, each providing their own piece of it. And then you've got parapsychology with all the evidence for non-local consciousness. For example, Guy Leon Playfair's book, Twin Telepathy, more than 35% of identical twins have powerful telepathic experiences. To the point where one twin can touch a hot stove and the other twin 1,000 miles away will have a blister and develop a pain in that finger. So that's a really strong telepathy. But things like remote viewing, which is one of the most proven parapsychological phenomena in the scientific literature, even though Wikipedia says remote viewing is pseudoscience, but that's because Wikipedia is a pseudo encyclopedia. Remote viewing has been proven by professionals and experts around the world to be a true phenomenon. And it's another example of this non-local consciousness, this thing that we're sharing the mind of the universe. And then, of course, quantum physics. Right at the heart of quantum physics is the deep mystery of the primacy of consciousness. And it has vexed brilliant scientific minds for the better part of a century or more. And we take all of these major scientific lines of inquiry and combine them in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, to make the case for primacy of mind. And our free will, as opposed to what materialist science would try and tell you, they would say you don't have free will. It's all chemical reactions, electron fluxes in the brain. They give you the illusion of free will, the illusion of conscious awareness. But they're wrong, because quantum indeterminacy by its very nature allows for the reality of free will in sentient beings. And when you explore that very deeply, you start to realize that it's undeniable. In fact, quantum physics, in this very open and powerful interpretation, not only allows for the reality of spiritual experience, it demands it, as opposed to the idiocy of, say, the many worlds interpretation, which some physicists still cling to. But infinite parallel universes unfolding at every choice point in an observation by a sentient being. It's even though the math and physics work, it's a very unsatisfactory explanation for the measurement paradox in quantum physics. So all of these things combined are what tell us that consciousness is primordial in the universe and that the physical universe emerges from consciousness. And that's what our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, is all about.
I can't wait to read this book. I am so excited. Do you know what? It's one of the things that I'm going to be reading that in a few weeks on my holiday. One of the things that I read, which is your kind of interpretation, and this really, I had to go back and read it a few times, was the brain works as a filter of consciousness, not the creator of it. Right.
That's an old concept, actually. The filter theory, as it's kind of loosely labeled, where the brain is a transceiver, or it filters in an eddy current of that primordial consciousness. And we assume that eddy current is all there is. And yet it's connected. And that's where remote viewing, telepathy, all those things, and of course, near death, shared death experiences are major examples of that connectedness of mind. But filter theory was very popular in the late 1800s, early 1900s. William James, head of psychology at Harvard University, was a huge proponent of filter theory, as explaining many of the phenomena he witnessed as a psychologist and psychiatrist. But then also you had people like F.C.S. Schiller, Henri Bergson in France, Aldous Huxley in the United States. He wrote a book, Doors of Perception, which was a brilliant set of insights based on his experience with mescaline, with the psychedelic, where he realized, the brain is not creating this. And now all this is borne out very strongly in the modern era, because there are scientific papers that have been coming out since 2012 that show that when you use functional MRI and magnetoencephalography to look at the brain in people under the influence of psilocybin, magic mushrooms, LSD, or DMT, among other substances that cause severe interactions and liberations of conscious awareness, if you do these brain studies on them, you find the brain is going dark. Functional MRI and magnetoencephalography show the brain basically getting out of the way. Anybody who's ever taking those substances would think their brain is lighting up like a Christmas tree. But that is not the case. The brain is not the source of those phenomenal experiences. They're happening elsewhere. When I read that first paper from Robin Carhart Harris in 2012, to me, it opened a tremendous window of refreshing sunshine, because I knew what it was like when meningitis took down my neocortex. And wow, what a brilliant ultra real reality I got to witness. Well, similar principles apply with these psychedelic substances, or entheogens, as I like to call them. Never call them hallucinogens, because that implies that what you're witnessing is a hallucination.
Yes.
Not. It's part of reality, and it's a deep spiritual reality to which we should pay attention. But and multiple papers since then have confirmed this. The brain gets out of the way. It goes dark. The default mode network, so responsible for kind of ego and sitting in the here and now and being present, the default mode network dissolves under the influence of these substances. So, the science fully supports brain does not create consciousness. We discuss all that also in Living in a Mindful Universe.
I guess, is that kind of well, I wanted to ask you two questions kind of in one question. And do you still do practices? Like, obviously a lot of people will do meditation to try and get their brain to that place to then go back into that. Well, do you do that now? Is that something that
I meditate an hour or two a day. I use differential frequency brainwave entrainment. I very specifically use sacredacoustics.com. Now, full disclosure, the co-founder of Sacred Acoustics is my partner, Karen Newell. We've been together for 11 years now.
Wow.
We are spiritual partners. She's the co-author of third book, Living in a Mindful Universe. That's by Karen Newell and myself. But yes, meditation is absolutely essential. The key here is to recognize our ego mind. The voice in our head is not our consciousness. I love how Michael Singer, in his book, The Untethered Soul, he calls the voice in your head your annoying roommate. Yep, that's the first answer.
Yes.
Consciousness, the mystery of consciousness is the self-awareness. That part is a really profound mystery that's hard to explain. And it turns out that a lot of this work can become very clear to people who are deep meditators, who spend a lot of time meditating. They come to realize they can get out of body. They can develop, ESP. They can develop skills, remote viewing abilities to see distant events across time and space. I mean, meditation is a tremendous boon. And basically, I would say you're just thinning the veil. You're heightening and cultivating your relationship with that primordial mind, with that God force of mind that is so reassuring to near-death experiencers for thousands of years, to reassure them that death is not the end. It's simply a transition. But this is all about a tremendous revolution in scientific understanding of the brain-mind connection and the nature of reality itself. But primacy of mind is essential to getting this. So idealism, or in a much more sophisticated way, I would say when you realize that all these minds are connected and it's really the mind of the universe that we're intersecting with in this notion of the brain filtering in that primordial consciousness, I would call it evolutionary panentheism. That's the philosophical term that I think is closest to what's really going on. Panentheism basically means the God force is in all of reality. The universe is within that consciousness of that God mind, and that we all share that. And it's evolutionary because we have free will. And that's due to quantum indeterminacy. The fact that within the world of quantum physics, which is exactly the world of neurons as quantum computers, because it's all due to ion channels and synaptic vesicles operating in the energy regime of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. And that's what allows for mind over matter to occur. So that all of this work in the brain is being coordinated by this top-down causality, that primordial mind. And it's filtered in a fashion that leads us to believe that it's just our mind and it's isolated. But scientific evidence reveals that it's not. It's interconnected with others. And meditation is one of the key ways to get to this deep realization through personal experience for the individual. And in fact, Living in a Mindful Universe is not only a great expose of the unification of science and spirituality in these major kind of big vision ways, but also it's a guide for the individual seeker for using meditation. We talk in there a lot about sacred acoustics, about binaural beats, and why they're so powerful. Every sound you've ever heard that might have engendered a transcendental conscious experience, a chant, anthem, hymn, what have you, is processed up in the temporal cortex, in the acoustic cortex and the temporal lobes. These are circuits that have basically evolved in the last 2 to 3 million years in primates and Homo sapiens. very different from the circuits that are intercepting that sacred acoustics binaural beat. That's all happening way down in the lower brainstem in circuits that are more than 300 million years old in evolutionary biology. I think that's one of the reasons why sacred acoustics, when you learn to kind of relax and go with the flow, allows for such extraordinary liberations of conscious awareness from the here, now, and sense of self. That's exactly what these oscillations in the lower brainstem do.
I must admit, I didn't realize about sacred acoustics. I've come across it, and the quality of the tracks is just absolutely incredible. I have been trying, Eben, to meditate for a very long time. My problem is I've got ADHD, and I've only just recently started coming across binaural beats, and it's the only thing I would say so far that's allowed me to quieten down and try and have that experience. I'm on my own mediumship journey trying to do this, and I do find it hard. It should be simple, but to quieten down my mind is not an easy thing.
That's where those tones can be very, very helpful. And, there's a free 20-minute download that we highly recommend. Go to sacredacoustics.com. You can find that. In addition, I will point out there is a scientific study, peer-reviewed in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, came out in February of 2020. It's by Dr. Anna Yusim, Y-U-S-I-M. And it was a peer-reviewed study to look at the use of sacred acoustics, binaural beats, for the relief of anxiety. She has a psychiatric practice in Manhattan and New York City, very busy, a lot of anxiety in a big city like that. And what she found is using sacred acoustics, just offering it to her patients. And it's called the Whole Mind Bundle. If you go to Sacred Acoustics, look up Whole Mind Bundle, and you can get the very same tones that were used in the study. She found a 26% reduction in anxiety symptoms over 2 weeks of listening. And that's compared to an only 7% reduction in the control group that received standard psychotherapy for anxiety. So a very powerful, amazing result for sacred acoustics to alleviate anxiety. And that, of course, is just the beginning. We know of addiction doctors, for example, who have patients who will come in drug withdrawal and overdose symptoms, et cetera. And they put headphones on and play the Sacred Acoustics file, and people just calm right down. It's very therapeutic in that acute kind of spiritual crisis setting. Likewise, we've heard from several acupuncturists who work with children who have tried to commit suicide in several places around the country, who use sacred acoustics to help calm the children down as they give them acupuncture and try and relieve the situations that led them to suicide or attempt suicide. And some of those kids are saying, wow, if I'd heard these sounds before, I never would have attempted suicide. So it's a lot of power. Also, I will point out that Whole Mind Bundle, Karen realized how anxiety was such a huge problem in this world during the COVID pandemic and the economic collapse that accompanied it. So she dropped the price on the Whole Mind Bundle, I think, to $19, which is an incredible bargain, but also because she realized some people in that pandemic and economic crisis wouldn't have the financial means. She gave a free option. There's a free button there. So you can download the same set of frequencies that were used in this very successful peer-reviewed study, Whole Mind Bundle, off sacredacoustics.com, and get the same great power. We hope people who can pay will pay, but the ultimate generosity and kindness of Karen.
That's lovely.
That. And Sacred Acoustics, her business partner, Kevin Cossey, I would also want to honor him in this work, but they're gifting the world with these incredible tones that can really be effective to alleviate anxiety and to help people with kind of spiritual awakening and spiritual journeying.
Oh, do you know what? Well, you've solved my evening for me, Eben. I know what I'm going to be doing tonight and what I'm going to be putting on.
Try out that Whole Mind Bundle.
Do you know what? Thank you. I think that's so lovely of you. To ask about your view now on kind of more holistic Eastern sort of energy-based medicines. Well, what's your kind of opinion on those sort of more holistic treatments versus kind of traditional Western medicines?
Well, I think there's a lot more to it, especially as we come to recognize that a tremendous amount of potential for healing is within our own grasp. And that's where I think meditation, centering prayer can be very helpful at bringing healing and wholeness, both to self and to, friends and colleagues and others that we might pray for and meditate for. So I've certainly gained a tremendous amount of respect for healing in this grander sense. And for me as a physician, that discussion starts with, for example, placebo effect. And many people misinterpret placebo effect. They think a sugar pill fixing a headache is unimpressive, but they don't realize that in many cases, you can have healing from very advanced diseases just because somebody believes they can get better and they believe they're doing something that can make them better. And so placebo effect is just the beginning of the power of mind over matter and a demonstration of how these beliefs and kind of attitudes can change our ability to heal ourselves and bring wholeness and healing to ourselves and others. And then, of course, you can get to beyond placebo effect is spontaneous remission. For example, if you go to noetics.org, the Institute of Noetic Sciences website, put in the search term spontaneous remission, you'll find a book that they published in the mid-1990s by Hirschberg and O'Brien, I think it is. And in that book, they discuss more than 3,500 cases of spontaneous remission of cancers, of advanced infections, other diseases, even congenital things people were born with, healing, but in ways that go completely beyond any medical intervention they've had. So it's showing kind of the mind over matter and the power of kind of spirit to help bring us into healing and wholeness. And then you can go to the grand, poobah, which is the miraculous healing in near-death experiences, which is one of the most extraordinary set of examples we have of how kind of spirituality can be associated with tremendous healing far beyond any kind of medical intervention. In fact, that was what those peer review editors at the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases were so impressed with in the case report on my medical records. There was no explanation for how I could have had such an unprecedented, miraculous recovery other than the fact that I had a near-death experience. And both the peer review editors and the people who had written the report knew of other NDEs with similarly profound healing, like Anita Morjani, who wrote the book Dying to Be Me, and her stage 4B lymphoma. She was deep in coma, 85 pounds, with weeping ulcers all over her skin, should have died within hours. Well, she didn't. She had a profound near-death experience, a spiritual experience, came back to this world knowing that her cancer would disappear, which it did. Or Dr. Mary C. Neal, she wrote the book To Heaven and Back, orthopedic surgeon, a kayaking accident in Chile in the late 1990s. She was driven under a waterfall, legs broken, kayak jammed under a boulder. She was underwater more than 30 minutes. Ask any doctor about what do you expect after an over 30-minute warm water drowning. And they'll tell you, well, you've got your brain is dissolving into liquid. It's no longer any good. You're dying or dead. They brought her to the surface dead, but they resuscitated her. She made an incredible recovery, went back to work as an orthopedic surgeon. I presented with her at conferences on near-death experiences. Mary Neal is a beautiful presenter and tells a gorgeous story of an NDE and the kind of spiritual healing that comes from it. So it should be a giant wake-up call to all of us. I know the thing that impressed Bruce Grayson, as a skeptical psychiatrist who's investigating these things for more than 45 years, was way back in the 70s when he saw that people who had near-death experiences, that the healing of their soul that came from these near-death experiences completely obliterated, and outmastered any healing that he was able to do as a psychiatrist with medications, et cetera, and therapy. And he was fascinated with the healing potential of these experiences. So there's a lot to be learned by this kind of deep dive into our spiritual nature and how each and every one of us has the power to bring this kind of healing and wholeness to our lives.
I guess lastly, Eben, I'd like to ask you, what do you think the future is kind of looking like between that bridging the gap between spirituality and science? Do you think there's going to be more research done into this? And What do you think where are we going, do you think, between...
Well, let's put it this way. It's no longer a question as to whether or not the afterlife and reincarnation are a definite part of a scientifically proven reality. They are. And I can say that with great assurance. And I can give you a resource. Go to bigelowinstitute.org. You will find 29 essays, 28 or 29, depending on how many legally could be included. But there were 29 winners of that contest. So bigelowinstitute.org, read Jeffrey Mishlov's first place paper. You'll quickly realize that it's no longer a question as to whether or not these events are real. They're absolutely real. They show us a much grander aspect of the universe and scientifically validated, because that was, in fact, the question that was asked in that contest. What's the best scientific evidence for the afterlife, for continuity of consciousness after permanent bodily death? And there are other scientific essays in there: Bernardo Kastrup, Pim van Lommel, Dean Radin, Julie Beischel, and others. Great scientists have written incredible essays in that contest. You'll realize if you do your homework, you no longer doubt the reality of the afterlife, reincarnation. This primordial mind starts to emerge as the most obvious explanation. In fact, Dr. Pim van Lommel, in his second place winning essay in that contest, at the end of it, he's getting to the one mind hypothesis, and he lists 4 resources for that one mind hypothesis, which is where the science is headed. I will tell you that's where the evidence leads. Those 4 resources: our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, also the book Spiritual Science by Steve Taylor, One Mind, the book by Larry Dossey, and then the paper by Bernardo Kastrup, Journal of, I think it's Consciousness Studies, 2018. It's called The Universe in Consciousness. And those 4 resources, Pim van Lommel said, are some of the best modern scientific resources on the one mind hypothesis. And I would also highly recommend Pim van Lommel's book, Consciousness Beyond Life. But for anybody who cares and is doing the homework, it's crystal clear that this is all very real. We need to understand much more about how it all works. Quantum physics is right at the heart of that. It's important that the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2022 was for entanglement. The spooky action at a distance that Einstein hated. But Einstein was absolutely wrong on this one. He thought hidden variables would explain it. But no, not at all. The 3 physicists who won that Nobel Prize, John Clauser, Alain Aspect, Anton Zeilinger, won it because they revealed spooky action at a distance is absolutely what it appears to be. It's a connection of information across time and space that keeps particles connected if they're created in a common subatomic event. And what I would say is that field of entanglement is an integral part of the quantum field, and it has everything to do with conscious awareness. I'm sure there are quantum physicists out there that will argue that there's some other non-conscious explanation for entanglement. But ultimately, the deeper you dive into consciousness, brain-mind connection, and the nature of phenomenal experience, the more you start to realize that mind over matter is the rule. Idealism or panentheism is the way it all works. It's not materialism. And we just need a richer understanding of this form of top-down causality. But the science is outlined and moving forward. And we'll never go back to the bleak and paltry fiction of materialism. And I'll also stress that fiction of materialism, with its false sense of separation, has been very damaging to this world. It leads to corporate greed for things like the energy industry. Scientists in the energy world have known since the early 20th century that burning carbon-based fuels would heat the planet, and someday it would heat it to intolerable levels. But the profit margins were way too huge for them to do that, to honor the science. But now climate change is getting to be such a horrible and an ever worsening issue. It's important for us to realize that things like corporate greed that are part of egotism and the materialist sense of separation do not fit a quantum informed world where we realize we're all in this together. We're responsible for the welfare of our fellow beings, not just humans, but all life on Earth. Depends on the stewardship that we do. And that's more of a kind of a spiritual journey of wisdom to show that we're here to take care of each other, take care of the least, the last, and the lost. and to really make this world a better place for all involved, but not through corporate greed and through that egotism and narcissism that is so toxic through our modern society, but through an acknowledgement of the scientific truth of the unity of consciousness, how we're all in this together. The deepest messages from near-death experiences are how we're all bound together through love, and that is what demands of an upshift in our worldview as humans and our culture and our civilization to this recognition of the scientific fact of eternity of soul, and that our lives go on, and that we're here to make the world a better place for all. That's what Life Reviews teach us. Treat others as you would like to be treated. Treat this world as you would like to be treated, which means treat it well. And we have to shift away from a lot of the kind of greed and kind of militarism and false sense of separation and materialism, and move much more to this scientifically validated world of common consciousness and binding force of love, that we're all in this together.
Do you know what? I love the work you do, and I completely agree with everything you're saying. And I have so much admiration for everything that you're doing. And I must say, Eben, I don't think you could have got more into this hour if you tried. There's so much. I'm going to have to go back and listen to this 3 or 4 times, because honestly, it's just some of the stuff you have said is just so profound and so interesting. I feel like we could sit here and talk for another 2 hours, but there's just so much to it. But I just thank you so much for everything that you're doing for society, for medicine. And, I'm really grateful, because without your book, I wouldn't be on this journey. And it's absolutely terrible that I haven't read your second one, which I can't wait. I am so excited.
Well, the second one is called The Map of Heaven, and that's really about the universality of these experiences. But it's not my personal journey is Proof of Heaven and Living in a Mindful Universe. I certainly also recommend Map of Heaven, because I think a lot of people gain tremendous benefit from that book. But the reality is, if you're mainly interested in my journey, that's Proof of Heaven and Living in a Mindful Universe. That's where all of that comes out.
Well, if you want to find out more about Sacred Acoustic or Eben's books, they'll all be in the show notes, so you can just go down and find them easily there. And all I will say is a massive thank you for coming on the Soul Sync. It's been so nice to talk to you, Eben.
Well, my pleasure, Jason. Thanks so much for having me on. The only other reference I would add is innersanctumcenter.com, INNER sanctumcenter.com. If you go there, you'll see there are multiple channels of new information, of learning more that Karen and I have put together, a set of interviews we did during the pandemic with thought leaders around the world. There's a monthly webinar where our fans keep in touch with us, all at innersanctumcenter.com. There's also a mental health practitioner course that we did with Dr. Anna Usom. So every bit of that is at innersanctumcenter.com. Thanks for all that you do, Jason, to get this out to the world.
Oh, thank you so much, and you have a good rest of the day. Well, there we go. Do you know what? I'm going to have to listen to that episode back at least 2 or 3 more times, because I don't know if you could probably tell while watching it, but my mind was blown, and I was really struggling to keep up with some of the things Dr. Eben was saying, because it was so profound and mind-blowing. So I really hope you enjoyed that episode as much as I did, and thanks very much as always for joining me on another episode of the Soul Sync podcast. Do remember that if you want to stay in the loop and get notified when new episodes are out, just simply hit the follow show button wherever you listen to your favourite podcasts. If you want to get involved in my Facebook community, I love hearing from you on there. I love reading your comments. I read every single one. You can find the details by just going to the show notes. All my socials are there. Also, remember, on my YouTube channel, there's going to be lots of videos coming up all about personal development. So do go over to my YouTube channel. Again, Jason Paul Medium is the handle. As always, if you want to get in touch with the show, the email address is also in the show notes. I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode. I'm Jason Paul, sending you lots of love. Until next time, goodbye.